Helldivers 2 launched last year to great acclaim, with near constant death-defying thrills and mayhem, but its PS5 version wasn't perfect, with somewhat compromised image quality when targeting 60 FPS, and performance issues to boot. Enter PS5 Pro. While developer Arrowhead Game Studios hasn't announced a PS5 Pro enhancement, there is evidence the multiplayer shooter has indeed seen a substantial PS5 Pro bump. So is this enough to solve the game's remaining technical concerns, or is this a bit of an illusory Pro upgrade? Helldivers 2 looks quite a bit better on PS5 Pro in performance mode when compared against its PS5 counterpart. We see a number of image quality improvements here. The Pro is more stable, doing a better job of resolving fine details like the fences around the training course. There's less shimmering visible to the eye, and the image generally appears more coherent in motion. There's also a perceptible jump in image detail. Text is clearer, edges are sharper, and textures resolve finer patterns. I wouldn't say it's a huge improvement, but side-by-sides reveal a clear edge for the Pro console. Rendering-wise, the differences are fairly uncomplicated. In my pixel counts, the PS5 version comes in at 1080p, while the Pro version gets an upgrade to 1440p, which is technically 78% more pixels. I couldn't find any signs of dynamic resolution in my testing, suggesting both consoles run with locked pixel counts. Critically though, that isn't combined with a temporal upsampling process to achieve a higher final effective resolution. Instead, a pretty mediocre TAA seems to be in use, providing edge treatment at the cost of some instability at rest. A lot of games this generation render at comparable or lower pixel counts, but end up with much better final image quality than this due to the use of upsampling solutions like TSR or FSR2. Arrowhead is sticking with a simple spatial upscale instead, with results that are somewhat mixed. Still, I think the PS5 Pro performance mode crosses an image quality threshold where I'm generally fine with the way it looks on a 4K set. The quality mode is a bit less compelling. Here, the image improvement is relatively slight, not really amounting to much generally speaking. On certain elements though, like the fences here, we can spot substantial differences. Foliage also generally looks cleaner in these side-by-sides on the Pro. The rendering setup here is again pretty familiar. The PS5 clocks in at about 1728p, though with a characteristic sharpness and edge smoothing that makes me think it might be using FSR1 as an upscaling solution. PS5 Pro takes the brute force approach instead, pulling off a full native 4K image. It's not a perfect solution, as the Pro can still struggle a bit with depth of field and doesn't deliver a perfectly stable rendition of all geometry, but it does have an edge over the base machine. Again, to see better results still, we'd have to see some revision of Helldivers 2's anti-aliasing technique. So we do have some strong visual evidence that Helldivers 2 has received a Pro upgrade, despite no public confirmation of one and no Pro Enhanced label on the PlayStation Store. But a viewer tipped me off that an Arrowhead employee said in a Discord chat that the game had indeed been upgraded for Pro. It's a strange way to announce, or not really announce, that a game has received a Pro upgrade, but we can confirm that in our testing there is a clear visual difference. Helldivers 2 offers some other image quality tweakables as well. The anti-aliasing toggle, which was broken at launch, actually works now. So if you'd prefer that pin-sharp no AA look, Arrowhead has you covered. TAA is pretty integral to the game's presentation, which I think is evident when you look at the screen space reflections just as one example, so I wouldn't recommend dropping it. But TAA does soften the image substantially, which is obvious in these head-to-heads. Arrowhead also provides a slider to dial in post-process sharpening to your taste. The performance mode looks quite soft with zero sharpening, and reasonably clear with max sharpening at the cost of additional edge artifacts. The difference in quality mode is a bit subtler, but sharpening has a definite role to play there as well. 0.75 is the default in both modes, which I think is sensible enough. Even the maximum value doesn't really have that crunchy look with ultra-defined edges, so any value here I think is pretty defensible. Beyond the image quality tweaks, I didn't spot any obvious settings changes, outside of minor discrepancies in SSR resolve or SSAO that often come alongside resolution changes. Helldivers 2 isn't especially lacking in any particular tweakable, like LOD distances or shadow resolution on PS5 though, so stasis there is perfectly fine. When we looked at Helldivers 2 last year, we found that performance was generally reasonable on PS5 in its performance mode, with dips in certain busier sequences, but that wasn't really spelling out the full picture, because we only had time to unlock and play through the game's more moderate, less hectic difficulties. Fortunately though, Calvin, a close friend of mine, is also a world-class Helldivers 2 player. So I asked him to carry me through some of the toughest missions around on the game's maximum Super Helldive difficulty setting, which promises the largest, most aggressive swarms of foes. Unsurprisingly, the frame rates are indeed worse than what we logged last year. On PS5 in performance mode, most of my gameplay in Super Helldive missions is sub 60 FPS, with long stretches in the 50s and 40s. Sometimes I'd even clock an extended run in the 30s, with the game clearly struggling to keep pace. The outset of any given match usually runs fine, but more enemy-heavy gameplay later on tends to suffer, with constant framerate drops. Lower difficulties present less of a concern, but players who are made of sterner stuff will find the higher challenge levels quite taxing on a base PS5. PS5 Pro has a lot of similarities. Helldivers 2 does like to spend a good amount of time in the 40s and 50s here in more challenging endgame content, but generally speaking, it doesn't seem to dip quite as hard in its worst moments. I didn't spot extended gameplay in the 30s for instance, despite playing quite aggressively. I did notice brief stutters at one point as well, across a few hours of capture. Of course, it's virtually impossible to match content across my capture sessions, given the hectic multiplayer-oriented nature of Helldivers 2. But my general impression is that the performance level is a bit higher on the Pro machine. It does a better job of sticking within a reasonable framerate window, and is more often compatible with the PS5 Pro's VRR range. The game doesn't support 120Hz output on PS5 or Pro, so you're limited to 48 FPS and above to get VRR smoothness. It's a curious situation, given that the Pro's resolution bump should theoretically eat up most if not all of the console's extra GPU capability, and it only has a mild potential CPU clock increase. But I consistently found a clear, meaningful framerate advantage on Pro in these ultra-demanding missions. The PS5 quality mode targets 30 FPS, but has frequent frame time inconsistencies, just like the launch game. Plus, in especially demanding moments, I saw genuine framerate dips beneath 30 FPS, though not by much. PS5 Pro has the same frame time wobbles, unfortunately, though actual drops below 30 didn't pop up for me in my testing. Neither console really offers a good experience here, unfortunately. That's probably not the end of the world though, because I expect most players will prefer the higher framerate performance mode here. Helldivers 2 isn't a Twitch game necessarily, but it does feel smoother and more controllable at 60 FPS. And the Pro does seem to come closer to that target, even if frame rates are still ultimately not quite ideal. Helldivers 2 is great fun. No other player versus environment multiplayer game captures the same sense of chaos, the same wild improvisation of explosions and retreats. With a squad firing on all cylinders, or indeed just one very skilled teammate, you can perform some incredible death-defying feats. I've never captured a game with the same density of incredible gameplay moments. And Arrowhead has been steadily adding content to the game as well. Updates have brought player-controllable vehicles into the game, along with a new enemy faction, melee weapons, and new guns and vanity skins. It's been expanded considerably since we first played it. At the same time, the game does have some lingering technical quirks. It lacks modern upscaling technologies like DLSS and FSR, frame generation, more advanced rendering features like ray tracing, and has some performance issues. It's also somewhat unstable. Over a few hours of testing with Calvin, we encountered a couple of dropped games, and he was disconnected from the game's servers at one point, requiring a game restart. Helldivers 2 had notorious network connectivity problems at launch, and those problems still haven't been resolved completely in my experience. But fixing these problems is perhaps more challenging than it would be for some developers, because Arrowhead is using Autodesk Stingray. This engine was used by a fair number of developers, mostly based in Sweden, but it was discontinued in early 2018. For the majority of Helldivers 2's development, Arrowhead had to work on the game without external engine support, which is a situation that must have been challenging to manage internally. It will be interesting to see what direction Arrowhead chooses to go in following the massive success of Helldivers 2. Developer Fat Shark has shown what the Stingray engine is capable of with continued iteration and development, producing one of the best looking multiplayer games around. On the other hand, it would be hard to fault Arrowhead for switching to another industry standard engine. In the interim though, it might be nice to see the adoption of FSR2 or PSSR for the console versions of Helldivers 2, just to get image quality to a really good place for 60 FPS play. That's assuming it would be manageable given their technical expertise and the deprecated state of the game engine. The PS5 Pro at least offers enough raw pixels to look decent enough, if not quite meeting the 4K 60 standard many Pro titles aim for. So Helldivers 2 is a reasonably good Pro experience. It's not transformatively upgraded, but it does look and run decidedly better than the base machine. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content and to get in touch use social media. Thanks for watching.